Aloha friends, it's Robert Stellick with Blue Planet Surf. Welcome to the top 5 tips for wing foiling beginners. This is an excerpt of an interview I did with Alan Cadiz. If you want to watch the full interview, go down below to the link. I just wanted to make a separate video of the top 5 tips for beginners. I think it's really great content for those of you getting into the sport. Okay, so let's get into the top 5 tips for wing foiling beginners. I asked you to come up with your top 5 tips for beginners to get into wing foiling. And you not only prepared some answers, but you even made a little video from what I understand. So let's start with that. What are your top 5 tips for beginners?
All right, well, thank you. Yes, I was thinking about those tips, and there's so many different things, but I tried to think about the key things. And I put together a little timeline video here. Tip number 1. And I just pulled these clips out of my inventory of clips and start on a big board. Now this is a windsurf board. We have a surplus of windsurf boards here on Maui. You might think a sup board would be a good substitute, but you really need the daggerboard unless you can put strap-on fins on your sup board. I don't recommend using the sup board. It really needs to have something with the daggerboard. And I recommend this for people who are just learning how to use the wing, just to learn the basics. You can learn on a sup board, I mean a foil board, but I recommend a large foil board to start with. Here I've got Frank Muppe here. He's a very skilled rider, and using a smaller board, it's challenging. So as a beginner, if you're on a smaller board, it's pretty tough to get going. And in the extreme case, a really small board, it has its advantages, but it's tough to get up on the smaller boards. And this goes through the whole spectrum. So as a beginner, you really want to have a floaty board. It's just more challenging to get up. There are advantages to the tiny board once you're up, but in the learning stages, you really want to have a floaty board.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
So that's tip number 1. So not everyone has access to the big boards, and it doesn't, because the learning curve is so fast, it doesn't always make sense to buy a big board. I mean, maybe for some, they've got a big family, or they've got a slow learning curve, or they're sailing in light wind. But if they have the option to rent, I would encourage that for the first, few runs. A mistake that a lot of people make is they'll run out and buy the board that they think they're going to end up on, maybe a 80 liter board. And it's a real struggle to learn on those smaller boards. You can do it, but it just takes a lot longer. So if you have access to a bigger board, take advantage of it.
Yeah, very good. And then I just wanted to mention too, if for people that have an old stand-up board or something, a big floaty stand-up board, there is a kind of a stick-on center fin dagger board available from Slingshot, I believe, that you can basically glue onto the bottom of your board and kind of make, if your board doesn't have a dagger board, and that makes a big difference because it keeps the board from just going downwind. If you only have the fins on the tail, the board is going to turn downwind, and it's going to be very hard to stay, crosswind.
I've seen people show up at the beach with the sup board and have that problem where they just go straight downwind.
Right. So yeah, that's basically, I guess, tip number 1 before you try to learn the wing handling with a regular board that doesn't have a foil on it, basically, right?
Yes, and if you don't have access to that, you can, learn on a foil board, but really get your hands on the biggest foil board you can get.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is another tip you add to, but also practice as much as you can on the beach before you get on the water, right? The wing handling, a lot of it you can practice on the beach before you're in the water.
Yes, I do have that. I think it's tip number 4 or 5. Okay, so tip number 2, you want to learn how to steer the board and turn around very close to the beach. Specifically, learn to turn around before you get out there. So this is my daughter. She has an interesting technique. She'll kneel down at the end of her run, do the turn on her knees so she doesn't fall in, and then stand back up. But the point is that you're turning around close to the beach. And when I say close, I mean 20 feet out. Get on the board and turn the board around 180 degrees to come back in. You don't want to get 100 yards offshore and realize you can't turn around. Now I can keep going, or I can keep going, or we can discuss that idea.
Yeah, I think that's a really good tip. I guess I know I've heard of people like they were so excited about getting up on foil and being able to go that they just kept going as long as they could before they fell in. But then when they got way outside, like in Hawaii Kai, for example, you realize, oh, I don't know how to go the other way, you know. So
and yeah, and Hawaii Kai is slightly offshore, if I remember.
Yeah, it's almost
offshore
straight
wind.
offshore.
So maybe that's a tip in itself. You know, you want to go in a place where it's side shore. If it's offshore wind, make sure you're sailing with a partner to keep an eye on you.
Yeah, and then also it's a good idea to just if you have a place where you can just go downwind and maybe park a car at the other end and don't have to worry about staying upwind in the beginning. Yes,
well, this next clip is all about staying upwind.
Okay.
And this is something that when I'm teaching my students, I try to focus on getting them to go upwind for a number of reasons. And the biggest reason is that you're not downwind. You don't have to walk back up or find transportation. You spend your time sailing back and forth instead of walking back up. So this next clip here is a little bit longer. It's actually a section of a video that I call Maximum Performance. This is the tip for beginners on turning the board upwind. And this is one of my edited videos. So I'll go ahead and play the whole thing. It's about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can stop and talk about it.
Okay, great.
One of the things I want to cover real quickly, this is more of at the novice level, and this is for almost the first time wingers. It's really easy to go downwind and end up downwind very quickly. What I want you to try and do is turn the board into the wind. This does two things. One is it gets you going upwind so you're not losing as much ground, and it slows the board. The strut is like a windsock or a weather vane. It wants to point the wing into the wind.
You can use this constant to leverage the board upwind or downwind by pointing the clue towards the back or front of the board, respectively.
So we call the back of the strut the clue, or back end of the wing. And if I point that wing, if I point it downwind, it's going to point the board downwind. So I want to point the strut behind me, or in this case to my left. And the more I aim it to the left, I'm pulling here, the more it turns into the wind. If I push it away, it turns downwind.
This is done while luffing the wing overhead and steering the board through your core. If you come from a windsurfing background, you'll recognize this is similar to windsurfing in that if you drag the clue towards the tail of the board will turn upwind. When you twist the wing towards the tail of the board, the wing wants to return to pointing into the wind, and as it does, it torques your body and board upwind. However, if you sheet in while pulling the clue back, the sheeting will overpower the steering, effectively canceling the wing's torque to turn the board upwind. I'll say it again, oversheeting cancels the upwind effort. Move your hands forward or sheet out as you twist the clue towards the back of the board.
So if you're going downwind fast and you're sheeting in, it's going to fight you. You need to sheet it out, turn it upwind, and then start.
Simply stated, luff the wing as you twist the wing to torque the board upwind.
I actually really like how you explained with the weather vane, and that, you know, if you pull it kind of the strut wants to point straight downwind, and then if you manipulate that, that'll give you a steering momentum. So I've never really heard it explained that way, but it like intuitively we know how it works, but it's hard to explain it to someone who doesn't understand that concept. So I think that's a really good way to explain it.
Thank you. I've been trying all different ideas. You know, one way to think of the strut as a rudder or a guide, and you're aiming that guide to torque the board on a bunch of different ways to show it. And even now I look at this and I'm like, oh, you know, I might do that a little bit differently next time, or try to explain it differently, which is, I try to attack the idea from a different angle and try different ways. And teaching this to my students early on, I couldn't understand why they were going downwind and what was causing it to go downwind. And even myself, I couldn't understand what was the technique to get it to turn upwind until I started, well, trying to solve the problems at night, going to bed at night, thinking, why were they having trouble? Why can't they do that?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I've been trying to capture it on video.
Nice. Yeah. Okay. I think we're ready for the next tip.
And okay, the next tip is more or less where you're standing on the board. So foot placement on the board. Let's start with being off foil. So when you're slogging out to the wind line, your front foot should be slightly on the windward side and your back foot on the, more or less on the stringer, as opposed to being this orientation. This is going to actually set you up to point further downwind, or that is, it's harder to go upwind in this position than this position. Now the next thing to determine is where to stand on the board regarding the board's flotation. So you may be comfortable standing in the front, but if the nose of the board is curling, you need to move back. On the other hand, if the tail is sinking, you need to move forward. Again, this is off foil. And once you find that flotation point, you want to adjust your foil so that you stay in this position as it comes up on foil. You can't be stepping forward as it transitions to on foil. So you want to have your feet in the spot when it foils. Okay, so one thing that I've done in the past with some of my boards is I've marked on the board some lines just as a reference point. So I kind of have an idea where to stand before it foils. I mean, ideally you want to be comfortably on the flotation. But when it foils, you want to make sure that your foil is matched with that flotation point. And having marks on the board just give you a better idea where to place your feet.
Yeah, exactly. And if the board is designed well and your foil's in the right place, basically where you stand to float in the center of flotation, it should also be more or less where you want to stand once the board lifts up, right?
Yes, yes, but you know, you can put the foil too far forward in the track or too far back, or if you have a foil with a lot of lift in it, you may have to adjust that. But yeah, so
and then another good point you had in a different video with the was being centered over the center line of the board too, like, because you might be able to fly on when the board's on the water. If you're not exactly in the center, it's fine, but once the board lifts up and you're on foil, you have to be centered exactly over the foil, like
yes,
over the center line of the board.
And that's the next clip here, staying centered.
Okay.
I do have I mean, in this shot here, you think more of front and back, where you're
right.
pressuring the nose down and you're kicking it up. But there's also the side to side. So that's this next clip here.
Okay, let's get into
And
that.
we'll just play that whole thing.
Okay.
Some people are afraid to learn to foil for fear of falling on the foil, a legitimate concern. So let's look at what causes this type of fall. So let's look at the foil. It generates lift. The front wing is lifting up, the back wing, the stabilizer is pushing down, but together there's force up through the mast, lifting the board. Now it's important that you trim your weight fore and aft. If it's too far in the front, you're going to stick to the water. If it's too far in the back, you're going to overfoil. So you're constantly trimming the weight fore and aft. But it's also equally important to keep your center of mass directly over the foil. So the foil is lifting up, gravity is pushing you down. And if they're equal, you stay centered over the board. But often, as a sailor, you have another force that the sail is pulling you laterally. So you need to compensate by leaning back against that pull. And when the board is flat on the water, you have the stability of the ocean, so you can put lateral push on the side of the board. But as soon as it comes up on foil, you don't have that stability, and any sideways push is going to cause it to, in this case, flip away, and you fall towards the foil on your bum. And here's a couple examples. Unlike windsurfing, where you're pointing your toes to keep the board flat, in foiling, you're flexing your foot to keep your ankles at a right angle to the board, or that is, your body mass is always over the top of the board, and the top means at a right angle too.
I have this drone footage, which really shows it, centered right over the top of the board. Even though he's hiked out, he's on. And then here, if you draw a line from the mast up through his center of mass, you can really see it here.
Mhm.
So if you're not centered, and I got one more clip here of not being centered, you can see it right there. It's the beginning and the end.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I always like to tell people to, before they try to wing and foil together, maybe just try to learn how to control the foil first. Like I guess even going behind a boat though is sometimes you got the pull from the rope, so you can kind of lean against the rope. So you can be a little bit off-centered on the foil, like kind of away from the pull of the rope if you're going sideways. But just to have that feel where you're foiling on the board without getting pulled or without pressure, so you understand that you have to be right over the center line of the foil and you can't be like offset.
Yeah, trying to isolate just the foil skills. I mean, the e-foil is one way, but the e-foil is different. The board is pretty heavy, so it's not as responsive as a regular foil board. Certainly the prone surfers that come to wing foiling, they have this skill already. Going behind a boat is good, but I have seen people that have learned behind a boat, and when they're out on the wing board, they're leaning back against the wing, trying to wheelie the board. And I'm like, no, you can't leverage the board like that with the wing, the way you can with the rope. But any foil time that you can get before you get on a wing is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So the next clip here is about wing handling. And that is, we talked about it earlier about practicing on the beach. And here's just a few things you can practice on the beach. Simple stuff like flipping the wing over. And this is a 6-meter wing, and trying to flip a 6-meter wing over in the water is pretty tough. So you can practice it on the beach. You can practice standing up, having the wing help you get to your feet. And the wingspan on a 6-meter, you have to go up to the wingtip to flip it over. So it looks easy, and it's relatively easy on the beach. It's harder in the water, but that's something you can practice. And just practicing, like for tacking or jibing, just practicing the hand movements of flipping the wing over, on just leaning back against the wing and the wind. And this is something you have to do where there's a breeze. You can't do it in your backyard where the wind's all swirly. You really need to have steady wind to get steady feedback. But this is worth doing, taking the time. And there's, in most of my instructional videos, I've got some kind of beach homework where you practice on the beach, whether it's the Heineken jibe or tacking or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice, I think. And a lot of times the beginners too if you don't have a wing, like a kiting or windsurfing or sailing background, just beginners have a hard time understanding exactly where the wind is coming from and how to angle your wing in relation to the wind, and which way you want to go in and out, what direction can you go and what directions you can't, you can't go straight into the wind, obviously, and things like that. That's things people don't understand at first, I think, or don't think about really. So just learning that. And then also I like to get people to just keep the wingtip kind of get the wingtip low to the sand, but without touching it, like controlling the height of the wing.
Yes.
On the beach,
And that's something that I mean, I've got videos on that, and all the clips here, this is just a fraction of the stuff that I have. And there's so much more. There's so many more tips, and these I wouldn't call these the top 5 tips. These are just 5 tips in general. And I also, the sport's still relatively young, and we may look back in a few years and think, oh, we were teaching that progression where it's so much better to teach this progression. There's still so much we're learning about the sport. Yeah, there's definitely the idea of sheeting and steering the wing. I've taken a couple stabs at explaining that. And in one video, I have one video up there already but I have another video where I'm trying to explain it more clearly to sailors or non-sailors. And just the idea of sheeting in and out to catch the wind and spill it, that's relatively easy. But when you throw in the steering of the wing up and down in front of you, like you said, having the wingtip right on the sand and taking it above your head and separating those two skills, it's a challenge to get people to understand that. I mean, it's really simple once you get it, but it's sometimes difficult to.
Yeah, you have to grasp that concept first. And and I like to, like, even the more advanced maneuvers and, like, all the different tacks and things like that on your Patreon channel, you have like really detailed videos breaking it down step by step into really easy to follow steps that very detailed. And so I highly recommend that. Your instructional videos are great.
Thank you.
And I think those beginner tips are great, not just for the beginners but also for more advanced guys, because you're gonna have to help other people that are learning and just understanding how to explain things, like how to steer the board up into the wind. I mean, those are kind of things, if you have a good way to explain it and to make it easy to understand, that'll help a lot,
Yes.
So, yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, my following on Patreon has grown almost to 700 at the moment, or just over 700 at the moment. And the range of skills on, there's beginners on there that are just trying to get up for the first time. And then there's advanced sailors that are asking for jumping and more advanced stuff. This recent video, the one you're looking at, gliding on foil, that's more for entry level. Gliding is a skill that you take for granted. It's really easy to do once you know how to do it. But I had a number of students recently that I could see they were relying on the wing for support, and they didn't have the feel for gliding.
All right, I hope you really enjoyed these top 5 tips for beginners. If you want to watch this full interview, just go down below to the link. And if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe to the Blue Planet Surf YouTube channel. And as always, we'll see you on the water. Aloha.